Here we go with Peter and I Love TDs facing off against Josue and his Raider Nation. Our quarterbacks had polar opposite starts. Big Ben, the Steelers doing it on the ground, getting a big lead, and then just nursing it all the way home. Big Ben, he only had 11.3 points, but Josue had Lamar Jackson and Sam Darnold. He was well on his way to 28.3 points. That Baltimore defense and special teams, they had about 22 points until late in the game. In the fourth quarter, they ended up with 9.6 points, and it was in that second half that Miles Sanders for Peter got the bulk of his 118 yards for 11.2 points. I Love TDs and Raider Nation, they would spar back and forth. Josue with Calvin Ridley, he racks in another touchdown, 6 receptions, 61 yards, and 12.9 points. But Peter countered with A.J. Brown, 3 touchdowns in the last 2 games, 5 receptions, 56 yards, and 17.6 points. Oh, but the stunner of them all, I Love TDs, picks up the Miami defense and special teams. They shut out the New York Jets. They had 1 interception, sacks galore, and Josue getting a little taste of his own medicine. The Miami defense and special teams puts in 22.1 points. In the Sunday night game, Peter had Robert Woods, Josue had Cooper Kupp and Darrell Henderson Jr. No, and Peter caught a couple of breaks in this one. This touchdown by Darrell Henderson, it gets called back on a penalty. They end up scoring a touchdown, but it goes to Robert Woods. 4 receptions, 29 yards, and a touchdown for 10 points even. Later on in the game, this pass to Cooper Kupp, 9 times out of 10 he comes down with that. That pretty much kept Cooper Kupp off the scoreboard. And guess what, folks? We would go to Monday night. For Josue, he had Travis Kelce. This guy is a fantasy beast. 5 receptions, 65 yards, 2 touchdowns for 16.5 points. And he also had Harrison Butker. He chipped 8 points. Kelce and Butker give Josue a 16-point lead going into the late Monday night game. Peter with Amari Cooper and Greg Zuerlein, Legatron, down 16 points, and it was deja vu all over again. At halftime, Amari Cooper was still being shut out. Greg Zuerlein, he had a field goal, but pretty much undid that when they went for a 54-yard field goal, and it wasn't even close, so he would lose points for missing that field goal. And it wasn't until late third quarter and in the fourth quarter where Amari Cooper would chip away at that lead. The lead would be cut down to 6 points with about 4 minutes remaining in the game. It was grueling watching all these touchdowns apparently set up for Ezekiel Elliott. Touchdowns set up for Michael Gallup. He got a couple of shots taken to him on that final drive. It would come up empty and they would finally target Amari Cooper, and it's no good. That was Cooper's shot to haul in the winning touchdown. But this thing would get strung out till 3rd and goal from the 1. Big Red delivers to Amari Cooper, and the Serpa household came apart at the seams with that score.
Oh, come on, to Coop. Coop! Coop!
Then Zuerlein with the all-important but never a gimme extra point puts it through. Peter comes back to win it on Monday night. Guys, the Limpieza got that win for me last time, and the Caracoles told me to pick up the Miami defense and play them against the Jets, and that was the Miami defense and special teams. That was the difference in this one. And some more poetic justice for Josue. He took down the undefeated Rolling with My Homies last week on the back of a 20-plus point performance from his Baltimore Ravens defense. And wouldn't you know it, of all the different ways to get off that Monday night schneid, Peter and I Love TDs do it against Josue on the backs of the Miami Dolphins defense and special teams. This one was an instant classic, at least in the Serpa household it was. But Peter finally gets that Monday night monkey off of his back. Josue drops a heartbreaker. We talked about that. It would have been better being blown out. And Peter, with I Love TDs, gets his second win in a row. And thus the running of the table begins. The game of the week. It was Hurricane Laura facing off against RJ, rolling with my homies. Laura, she lost Dak Prescott last week, so Joe Burrow was pressed into service. Joe Burrow would have the best game of his early career. 406 yards, 4 total touchdowns, 1 interception to the tune of 40.5 points. RJ, he had a pretty good quarterback as well, Patrick Mahomes, although in this game he would be held to 200 yards passing and 1 touchdown for his lowest point total so far this year, 12 points. RJ's receivers, they would be held to no touchdowns but would make it up in spectacular fashion. Keenan Allen, 12.5 points, and not to be outdone, Kenny Golladay, 11.4 points. For Laura's receiving squad, they would take a blow. Odell Beckham Jr. making the tackle. OBJ out the rest of the season with a torn ACL. These injuries have become almost like a rite of passage to play for Hurricane Laura. But when her offense couldn't do it, the defense steps in. Buffalo, their defense and special teams, they feasted on the New York Jets. 2 interceptions. They allowed only 10 points. They put up 16 points. Heading into the Sunday night game, RJ, he was done. He could only sit back and watch as Team Hurricane Laura had DK Metcalf from Seattle to play. Down only 2.5 points. It would get cut down to 0.2 of a point in the first quarter. But then a long and agonizing 3 quarters would pass before they would even throw his way. DK Metcalf, he would see targets come his way, but none that were realistically catchable. At 6:50 in the fourth quarter, it was the game within the game. This beauty of a touchdown put the Seahawks up 10 points with 6 minutes and 50 seconds left. With 2 minutes and 30 seconds left, Kyler Murray would put the Cardinals within 3 points. Situationally in the game, up 3 points with 2.5 minutes to go, you would figure that the Seahawks wouldn't be throwing it in the air. But with Pete Carroll, you never know. He's got a reputation for throwing the ball when he should be running it. Then at 1:42, 3rd and 2, the Cardinals with no timeouts. A first down ends the game, but the Cardinals defense comes through. Overtime, the only hope Laura has. And Zane Gonzalez, he got it. We would go to overtime. It would be another excruciating 8.5 minutes before they would look DK Metcalf's way. And then finally, with 1 minute, 12 seconds left to go in overtime, DK Metcalf busts this one, 48 yards for the touchdown, but oh, there's a flag on the play. The touchdown gets called back. The very next play, the Cardinals intercept it. 30 seconds later, they win the game. And DK Metcalf and Hurricane Laura fall 0.2 of a point short. Laura, if you're tanking games in the hopes of getting the number 1 draft pick next season, forget about it. We do a lottery to decide the draft order every year. RJ, by the smallest of margins, actually the smallest margin of victory in league history, 0.2 of a point, hangs on. He goes to 5-2, and Hurricane Laura drops to 1-6. The game of the week. It is RJ rolling with my homies, going up against Nick Horeliak and his Killer Bees. This one was almost over before it even started. Patrick LaVon Mahomes II pours in 416 yards, 5 touchdowns for an apocalyptic 47.4 points, the highest scored by one player so far this season. The Jets defense did not register one interception, not one fumble, not even a sack. And here we go again with this nonsense from Patrick Mahomes. These two plays right here were scored as passing touchdowns. He did the exact same thing in week 4, and y'all complained about Tom Brady being dink and dunk? Whatever. But one player does not a fantasy football roster make. Kenny Golladay, he left the Colts and Lions game early and put up 0 points. Kittle also left the game in the fourth quarter with a foot injury, but Seattle had him on lockdown. He only had 2 receptions, 39 yards, and 3.9 points in the fourth quarter. Nick, his newfound running game featured Josh Jacobs. No touchdowns, but Jacobs did rush for 128 yards at 0.1 a pop. That's 12.8 points. And David Montgomery also did his damage through volume, 89 rushing yards and 16 receiving yards for 10.5 points. Rolling with Mahomes' offense had come to a screeching halt until the afternoon games when Keenan Allen for RJ would register his next TD. In Denver, Allen goes for 9 receptions, 67 yards, and a touchdown for 12.7 fantasy points. But Mike Badgley, the Chargers place kicker, bested that with 3 field goals and 3 extra points for 15 points. Badgley, however, would be the least of RJ's problems. Russell Wilson, he tore up that vaunted San Francisco defense with 23 rushing yards, 261 passing yards, 4 touchdowns, 34.1 points. Russell Wilson for MVP. So far this season, Russell Wilson leads the NFL in touchdown passes with 26. The next closest quarterback is, coincidentally, Patrick Mahomes with 21. Russell Wilson has 5 more touchdowns in 7 games than Mahomes does in 8 games. Russell Wilson, money. Going into the Sunday night game, Nick down 2 points. Score was 82.1 to 84.1. Nick had Philadelphia running back Bart Scott. RJ, he was rolling with Ezekiel Elliott, Zeke the Freak. And these guys would go at it mano a mano. Every time these guys touched the ball, it seemed like there was a lead change. In the first quarter, Zeke the Freak would rush for 27 yards, and Bart Scott would rush for 47 yards. After the first quarter, the game is tied 86.8 to 86.8. In the second quarter, Ezekiel Elliott struggled. He managed only 5 yards. Bart Scott kept it going hot. He goes for 25 yards in the second quarter. At halftime, RJ 87.3, Nick 89.3. In the third quarter, Ezekiel Elliott would get 25 yards, and for Bart Scott, 2 yards, but more importantly, this fumble would set him back. At the end of 3, RJ up 89.8 to 89.5, 0.3 of a point. In the fourth quarter, Ezekiel Elliott would rush for a mere 16 yards, and Bart Scott, he would rush for 8 yards. And that's the final. RJ rolling with Mahomes, 91.5 to Nick Hereliak's Killer Bees, 90.1. I said this in the league chat. The Rolling with Mahomes versus Killer Bees game was more compelling than the Dallas Cowboys versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Nick, Russell Wilson's 3 interceptions cost you last week, and that fumble in the third quarter by Bart Scott would cost you this week. You hear it all the time from the announcers. Whoever has the least turnovers wins 90% of the time, as it's been laid bare the last 2 weeks for you, Nick. Welcome to Heartbreak Hotel. With the victory, rolling with my homies, RJ, he improves to 6-2. Nick, you and your Killer Bees drop to 2-6. The game of the week. It was Pedro Da Chief playing against Josue and his Raider Nation. And on Thursday Night Football, Da Chief had Kyler Murray. He put up 269 yards, 2 touchdowns for 21.6 points, playing against Seattle and that porous secondary. You thought you would get a few more points from Kyler Murray, but not to be on this Thursday night game. In the Sunday morning games, Pedro's starters began to sputter. T. Higgins in Cincinnati, he had 2.6 points, Austin Hooper 3.3 points, and Joey Sly, the place kicker for the Carolina Panthers, would lead the way in scoring for the Sunday morning games for Pedro with 10 points, leaving the door wide open for Josue to come in and make up some ground, but he made up very little ground. DJ Chark Jr., that Pittsburgh defense had Jacksonville all locked up all day. He only had 4.1 points. That Baltimore defense and special teams that has been good to you all year also had a little bit of trouble with the Tennessee Titans, and the killer was that touchdown by Derrick Henry in overtime. That made you start losing points for your defense. They finished with 4.2 points, and your number one running back, Alvin the Natural Kamara, facing Atlanta and that super weak Atlanta Falcons defense, he got 45 yards and a touchdown for only 10.5 points, so a little underwhelming performance from the Natural. In the afternoon games, Pedro started to put some serious distance between him and Josue. Aaron Jones up there in Indianapolis, facing a tough Indianapolis Colts defense. The Packers scored 31 points, but out of that, Aaron Jones would only get 13.1 fantasy points for 41 yards and a touchdown. And in such a shootout, you would have thought Aaron Jones would have had much more than that. But nonetheless, 13.1 for Aaron. Oh, but you made up for it with Melvin Gordon III. 84 yards, 2 touchdowns, and a fumble, but that fumble didn't hurt him too much. He finished with 18.4 points. In the prior 3 games against weak defenses, Melvin Gordon did not reach 5 points in any of those matchups. But against Miami, the number 4 ranked defense, he goes for 18.4, so go figure. It was starting to look bleaker and bleaker for Josue, but he busted out the buzzsaw. Justin Herbert, against the hapless New York Jets defense, he puts up 366 yards, 3 touchdowns for 30.1 fantasy points. How good is Justin Herbert this year? Those 3 touchdowns against the Jets made Justin Herbert the only rookie all-time in National Football League history to have 5 games or more with 3+ touchdowns. And maybe even more impressive than that is that those 3 touchdowns extended his NFL record streak of games with multiple touchdown passes to 7. 3 touchdowns against Tampa Bay, 4 touchdowns versus New Orleans, 3 touchdowns against Jacksonville, 3 touchdowns against the Broncos, 2 touchdowns against the Raiders, 2 touchdowns against the Miami Dolphins, and 3 touchdowns against the Jets. Justin Herbert, money. And in that wild game up in Minnesota, Justin Jefferson, he made the most of his 3 receptions. He turned those into 86 yards, one of them for a touchdown, for 14.6 points. And then the cherry on top, Brian McManus, he added another 9 points heading into Sunday Night Football. It was the Kansas City Chiefs show on display on Sunday night. Pedro had Edwards-Helaire, 69 yards, 2 touchdowns for 19.7 points. He also had Tyreek the Streak Hill, 11 receptions, 102 yards for 16 points even. But for whatever reason, the Las Vegas Raiders seem to have the Chiefs' number. They put up 31 points. Kansas City only got the 1 interception, and so a measly 2.3 points against the Raiders. Josue in some serious trouble. He needed a big game from his tight end. And when you say you need a big game from your tight end, that's usually reaching for points. But not with Travis Kelce. He had 8 receptions, 127 yards, and a touchdown for 18.8 points from the tight end position. Travis Kelce has scored 129.7 points this season. The next closest person is Jonnu Smith with 81.9. Travis Kelce holds a 45-point lead over the second closest tight end. He scores more like a number 1 wide receiver, averaging almost 13 points. And on top of that, he has the best celebrations in the NFL. Give me all of Travis Kelce that you want. Even with that monster game from Travis Kelce on Sunday night, Josue went into Monday night with a 12.8-point deficit. His last starter, Cooper Kupp, wide receiver for the Los Angeles Rams. On the Rams' very first drive, Cooper Kupp would get 5 receptions, 62 yards, knocking that 12.8-point deficit down to 6.6 points. In the second quarter, Jared Goff would find Cooper Kupp 4 more times for 47 more yards. In the third quarter, the Tampa Bay defense finally wised up and started doing something about Cooper Kupp. They would hold him to 1 reception for 17 yards. Going into the fourth quarter, Josue was down by only 0.2 of a point, and Tampa Bay continued to key on Cooper Kupp. In the fourth quarter, the Rams would only look once towards Cooper Kupp, but that's all he would need. Jared Goff hits Cooper Kupp for 19 yards with 3 minutes and 1 second left in the game, and that is all Josue would need to pull out the victory. Oh, if everyone could have seen the league chat when Cooper Kupp had that reception in what may very well be the game of the year. The buzzsaw that is Josue comes out with a razor-thin victory over his familia, Pedro Guzman. Pedro went toe-to-toe with Josue for 60 minutes, but the fantasy football god said, "Thou shalt not pass." With the victory, Josue improves to 8-3, and a crushing loss for Pedro being only 1 game out from playoff contention. He drops to 6-5. Game of the week. It was Josue and his Raider Nation going up and playing Hurricane Laura on Thanksgiving. Laura got off to a good start. She had Logan Thomas, tight end from the Washington football team. He got a score and 20 yards and 9.1 points from the tight end position for Laura. But Josue has Travis Kelce, so you knew that wasn't going to hold up very well. And what was going to hold up even less was Las Vegas' own Derek Carr registering minus 1.6 points, and he played 3 quarters. I've never seen that from the quarterback position, playing a full 3 quarters and ending up with a negative score. And then Jonathan Taylor in Indianapolis, he comes down with COVID at the last minute and doesn't play. And so far it was par for the course for Laura, and this year she's having. That Atlanta Falcons would plague Laura all day long. Matt Ryan, he decides to complete some passes downfield, and 6 of those went to Calvin Ridley for Josue, 50 yards and a touchdown for 11 points. It was another thriller that the Vikings were involved in. Justin Jefferson caught 1 touchdown the week before, and he would catch 2 more this Sunday, putting up 19 points. Cooper Kupp, who delivered a win to Josue last week, falls flat this week. He would rack up 2 receptions, 41 yards, and 4.1 points. Laura was able to offset those Cooper Kupp points rather handily. She had Devontae Parker, and Parker benefiting from Fitzmagic. He had 8 receptions, 119 yards for 11.9 points. With Jonathan Taylor scoring 0 points, Josue and Alvin, the natural Kamara, were ready to start putting the nail in the coffin, but Kamara, up in Denver, puts in 5.2 points, and New Orleans scored 31 points. Taysom Hill, is starting to get into Alvin Kamara territory, gobbling up touchdowns when they're close inside the 10. But at the same time that Taysom Hill vultures touchdowns away from Kamara, he also does that for Michael Thomas and Laura. That's her number one receiver, Michael Thomas. He would finish with 5.1 points. And Nyheim Hines for Laura, he puts in 9.5 points. Josue had that Los Angeles Rams defense and special teams. They had 16.2 points. They had a touchdown, an interception, 2 fumble recoveries, and allowed 17 points. But Laura had the Carolina defense and special teams, and they scored 2 touchdowns. They had 3 fumble recoveries, allowed 28 points, and they best the Rams defense and special teams by 4 points by posting 19.6 points. This doesn't happen often, but Harrison Butker has his Butker handed to him. He put in 9 points, but Young Ho Koo from Atlanta, 5 for 5 for field goals, 4 for 4 for extra points, a whopping 21 points from the kicker for Laura, and all of a sudden it was a game heading into Monday night. Josue was done. He was standing at 89.9 points. Laura, down 14, had one more man to go. It would come down to DK Metcalf on Monday night again. And we all remember the last time it came down to DK Metcalf in the most gut-wrenching loss in fantasy football history. In Week 7, DK Metcalf went into the game, Laura trailing only 2.5 points. It wouldn't be until about 1 minute left in overtime where DK Metcalf would get this apparent 46-yard touchdown only to have it stripped away by a penalty. Laura would go on to lose that game by 0.2 of a point. We fast forward to this Monday night. DK Metcalf, he had 14 points to make up. After the first quarter, DK Metcalf would have that lead cut down to 10 points. Seattle, they kept feeding the beast DK Metcalf. In the third quarter, he was down 0.5 points. And repressed memories of the Week 7 loss came flooding back to Laura. But they would not wait until the last minute for this one. DK Metcalf in the fourth quarter puts it away for Laura. And he does it without a touchdown. It was pure volume. 10 receptions, 177 yards for 17.7 points. And Hurricane Laura comes back on Monday night on the back of DK Metcalf's 17.7 point performance. And in the cosmic gag reel that is the LVFL universe, Laura, she beats Josue for the second time this year. Her only 2 wins come against Josue, the very same Josue that had the number 1 ranking for 11 straight weeks. The same Josue that is the second seed. The same Josue we celebrated that Laura beat last time. Oh, this is like the Cowboys and Redskins, like the Bears and Packers, a division rival. You could throw the records out the window when these two teams play. Anything can happen. Laura gets her second win of the season and puts Josue at a very precarious 8-4 record. Only a couple of short weeks ago, I said this: no matter how bleak your ascension into the playoffs might seem, or how unthinkable that you would fall out of the playoffs, just remember, stranger things have happened. And here we are in Week 12 with Josue on the precipice of not making the playoffs. We were all Hurricane Laura fans this week. No offense, Josue. But now Josue fighting for his life at 8-4. And Hurricane Laura, as we said, improves to 2-10.